Should we wait for Julia?
We've got our adoring folks at home.
Oh, yes.
All right, I think we're ready to get started. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second town hall of our spring 2022 series. This morning, we are joined by Justin Owen, our CEO, and Jackie Casey, our CEO, and Jackie Casey, our COO. As you might notice, Melanie is not able to be with us this morning, but she is joining us from Zoom and should be able to contribute that way as well. This morning, we've got a pretty exciting topic to talk about. Is the long-term care plan. That's something that I really don't know much about, so I'm very excited to learn more too. During the presentation, we would really appreciate it if our Zoom audience kept themselves on mute. But if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be functioning as the moderator.
About 10 seconds, I think.
Okay, I think we're ready to begin. Once again, welcome everybody to the second town hall.
So as Brian said, good morning. I'm pinch hitting for Melanie, as we said. So I'm happy to jump in and help out with what I can. But Jackie and I just wanted to go ahead and bring everybody up to speed on the long-term care planning. Some of you might know it from its previous names of perpetual care. There have been discussions about endowments and taxes, and basically the conversation about how are we going to take care of the preserve for the long term. So the citizens, the Conservancy, the stewards, everyone involved did a great job working on acquisition and looking at all of everything that it took. Just checking one technical thing. Yep, okay. Because I remember last time we were muted, so I wanted to make sure we weren't. But basically how we got here, and one of the questions that's come up, at least in my 5 years here, and I know for many years ahead, was how is the city planning on maintaining this amazing place? We all know that it is the city's largest asset, and they don't have a dedicated funding source for ongoing maintenance of it. So the Conservancy, primarily Jackie and the team, has been working with city staff and the Preserve Commission for the last really 2.5 years on what does that look like. And we had great steward input and multiple stakeholders from the city. What I'm going to talk about briefly this morning is just how we got here. And then Jackie's really going to dive into the work moving forward. So as most of you know, we're 31 years old. We're 4 years older than the Preserve. And for those of you that are new to the Conservancy, a lot of people don't realize that we're older than the Preserve because we're the folks that advocated for it. We're the folks that said we need to preserve this beautiful, amazing place. 27 years ago, the City Council did their historic vote to dedicate the Preserve. If you were fortunate enough to be here, you saw they held the council meeting at Brett's Barn at Westworld with the Preserve in the background. Getting the City Council up to North Scottsdale was quite the historic feat from what I've been told. So it was great to get the folks up here. Those of you that may remember, originally there was one recommended study boundary, and that was pretty much the southern half of the Preserve. Later on, the city went back to the citizens when they went for additional votes to grow the recommended study boundary as it sits today at about 34,000 acres. The Preserve itself, as of today, is 30,580. So you'll hear a little bit later what's land acquisition look like, what maintenance look like, the fun things that I get to deal with every single day. So I'd like to give some people the fun facts on it. If you think about Scottsdale has the lowest permanent sales tax in the valley. It's quite crazy, but we have some temporary taxes that are put on there. So the first preserve tax that was adopted in 1995 is 0.2%. The second one that was adopted in 2004 is 0.15%. So collectively, the city sales tax for the preserve is 0.35%. A lot of people say, well, that's not a lot because I pay 8.1% tax when I buy things. Well, a lot of folks don't realize that's the state, the county, everyone else gets their cut in it. The city sales tax is 1.75%, and 0.35 is the preserve. If you think about it in the grand scheme of things, 20% of the sales tax that's paid in Scottsdale goes to the preserve. That's why we feel it's so, one of the reasons why we feel it's so monumentally important that we maintain this place in perpetuity and that there is a dedicated funding source to do so. The city treasurer's office estimates by the expiration of the 2034 sales tax, the city will have spent between $2.4 and $2.8 billion on the preserve. As the mayor said at a city council session in December, it's on the city's books at over $6 billion because they put it the value of what it is as an asset, not only what they purchased it for. And when you think about it, as of 2 years ago, things of inflation's happened a lot, but the city's second largest asset was its water treatment facility up off Pima at about $900 million. So it's a pretty big gap in between. And the Conservancy has helped for the last 30 years be the folks to take care of it and help maintain it with the amazing staff from the city that does it. But what happens if there's another downturn? What happens if there is an economic issue that causes a huge reduction in revenue that the city can do without a dedicated tax revenue source or even a dedicated funding source? What's to say that they can ensure the resources need to happen to maintain this amazing place? So a little bit more on the historical side of it because it plays into the long-term care plan. In 2015, the city adopted the Ecological Resource Plan for the preserve. One of the things that we are so proud of as a Conservancy is our stewards helped write the ERP. They helped get it through the commission, ultimately to the city council for adoption. One of the things that is really a defining factor about the ERP is that it is a very high-level document. It says, these are the things that we need to do to monitor the ecological health of the preserve in broad categories, not specifically. So as we were working through this process the last few years, we know when you're going to the citizens for a vote, they want definitive things. They say, okay, if we're going to fund this, what are you going to do? And the Ecological Resource Plan gave a broad idea, but Jackie will revisit a little bit how we're going back to do that in the future. So one of the things that came out of this history and working towards the long-term care plan is the need to refine and define the Ecological Resource Plan. While the city council has not adopted its fiscal 23 budget yet, the city runs on the same fiscal year as the Conservancy, July through June. They have put in an amount of money to refine the Ecological Resource Plan. So they have built into the yet to be approved budget some money to be able to put some definitive measures in on the ERP. Now, one of the things that the city has reassured us and the commission is that just like the last ERP, we have a seat at the table. We are going to be part of the group, not the sole organization, part of the group of organizations that is going to help refine it into what are the direct measurables that we can tell the voters need to happen. Another thing that you may remember is in 2017, we were awarded through a competitive bid process a contract to do restoration and invasives management. That was the first time that the Conservancy had gotten direct funding for the city from the city, for the work we do. It's less than about $100,000 a year, but it was a step that we went through to make sure that it was transparent and clear that we went through a competitive bid process. Other people could have bid to work on these things, but ultimately we won because we have an amazing bank of stewards that allows us to do the work at a much more affordable rate. Now, one of the things as we move forward is the two key topics, sort of like we talked about, how do we look after the city's largest asset without a dedicated revenue stream? That's sort of how we came to this. The city council posed the question to the Preserve Commission and ultimately to us that we worked on, how do we take care of this asset? And then secondarily, what do we do about the remaining roughly 3,500 acres of the preserve? What does land acquisition look like moving forward? And in December, it was presented by the Preserve Commission to the City Council, those two separate topics. The first one is long-term care of the preserve. The Preserve Commission came to the City Council and said that if the city could dedicate between $2 and $3 million a year, it could fund the work that the city needs to do to maintain it. And to be clear, that is a city line item. That's not us. That is not, oh, the Conservancy is looking for this. The city currently spends about $1.2 million itself on its 4.85 staff, all the janitorial work, the trail contractors, all the things that it's currently doing, and it takes that out of the general fund. Based on the number that they have presented of that 2 to 3 million, it puts the city up over 2 million to be able to bring on additional staff to work on the projects with it. And as well, we're hoping, because it includes a small amount that Jackie will go into for restoration, preservation, and education. So one of the things that we worked with the Preserve Commission, knowing that the Conservancy currently fundraises a substantial amount of money to provide those activities in the preserve. We said, as a responsible business, we would like to make sure that we can ensure that in an economic downturn. So there is a portion in there for an education and preservation contractor, whether that be the Conservancy or someone else. We were very transparent and that we would go through a competitive bid process again and go through other organizations and see who was interested in doing the work if they're able to successfully find that. One of the things that we reassured the city is we're not going anywhere. We're still here and going to be the champions of the preserve in perpetuity. But in order to guarantee a level of service, we would like to be able to bid on some of those if possible. So that way, if something goes down, those of you that have seen the organization through the ebbs and flows of recessions know when recession happens, a lot of the times we cut back on resources. And with that, it can pose a challenge moving forward. Ultimately, what the City Council has decided, it's tentative, this could always change, was that it will go to the voters in November of 2024. So the city looked at 3 separate options. They looked at for those of you familiar with the Perpetual Care Fund, they looked at what would it be like to take the rest of the tax revenue from the current preserve taxes and put it in an endowment or an annuity or some kind of financial instrument that then could pay dividends every single year. And those dividends would then pay for the ongoing maintenance of the preserve. They came up against 2 challenges with that. The city officers said that they believed the voters want their money used now. They want to see when they pay transportation dollars, the roads get improved. When they pay for getting more staff, they want to see them hired. They don't want to see their funds put somewhere else for safekeeping for the future. Whether we all agree or disagree with it, that's one of the things they looked at. The second was going back to the voters for a new preserve tax. And as we all know, it took the most amazing work in our world to be able to get those first 2 preserve taxes. A lot of people have said in the current political climate, if we went to voters for a tax for a recreation-based item, it probably wouldn't be successful in today's political climate. Whether that be true or not, it was a very valid point. And then the third one was a renewal of the original preserve tax that's expiring in 2025. That's the 0.2% you heard me talking about a little bit earlier. And one of the things that the city looked at was, okay, and for folks, the most conservative number of what 0.2% is $20 million a year. That's what the city estimates as a conservative for a 0.2. So if you heard me say earlier, the Preserve Commission is recommending a 0.02 to a 0.03 for the preserve. What the city has let us know is they intend to go back to the voters for the full 0.2%. And of course, the Preserve Commission did a very good job asking why. If we would go back for renewal for the 0.2 and the preserve only needs 0.02 or 0.03, help us on that journey. And the city said, because the city has other great needs. The city thrived before probably before really the Great Recession, if any of you lived here, but then you could call the city and within 24 hours of reporting a pothole was filled. You remember that the police response time and fire response time was very high because our population was much lower. As the city's grown, they've identified other needs in other city departments, whether that be community services for our aging population, fire, police, where have you. They've identified that they would like to go back to the voters for the 0.2%, not only for the preserve, but for other important necessary city services. Now, one of the things the Conservancy views that is a really good thing. And we talked about it from the perspective that if we were to go back to the voters, again, in this political climate for purely a preserve tax, the odds of it being successful aren't as great. But if it's included in a tax that includes streets, includes police, includes fire, it's a lot higher likelihood that it would be successful with the voters. So we plan on supporting the city in going back and doing that, just like we did with the first two taxes, of advocating for the residents to pass that. And then the second part of that equation, which they have said will be a separate endeavor, is land acquisition. So at the December City Council meeting that we were at where they spoke about this, it was the first time the City Council had said in over 25 years that land acquisition was no longer the top priority. We celebrated that City Council said ongoing maintenance is the top priority. That's huge. That's a great win. And people say, how so? And it's purely land values. So for those of you that follow land values in North Scottsdale and in the neighborhood, a lot of why the preserve is possible is because it was able to get a lot of it at 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 an acre. The state land department that owns the remaining 3,400 acres has said they will not accept anything less than $300,000 to $500,000 an acre. At that, that's a substantial difference. With the city's forecast of $80 million that's left in the preserve tax, that's not enough for 3,400 acres. That's enough for a couple hundred. So one of the things that the City Council worked with through the Preserve Commission is for the remaining 3,400 acres, it would probably be over $2 billion at the 300 to 500,000 acre. And we think that'd be a pretty hard sell for the voters to say, okay, we got these 30,500 for $2.5 billion, give us another $2 billion for 3,000. It doesn't seem like the best investment. And that was at that range of 300 to 500,000 acres. For any of you that follow real estate, 2.5 weeks ago, the state land department sold 100 acres off Bell and the 101 at over $1 million an acre. With what real estate's doing, that the rest of that could be substantially more. So the City Council said they want to revisit land acquisition. The first thing they want to do is look at the remaining funds, work with the Conservancy and stakeholders and community groups in the community to say, what is the priority areas? What is the most environmentally sensitive areas that are left? City staff and the Preserve Commission said they're going to take their first look at the area north of Pima Dynamite. When we talk about what's the most environmentally sensitive and learning from our citizen scientists and our folks, a great example of what's not the most environmentally sensitive is the land between Legend Trail and Cave Creek, or between Legend Trail and Pima, because it's between two urban interfaces. So that is not as sensitive as maybe an area in the washes north of Pima Dynamite. So it's a future conversation that the City Council is intentional of breaking those two issues apart because they can be highly political. We have a lot of folks that still believe that the recommended study boundary is our ultimate goal, no matter the cost. So one last thing before Jackie takes this over and you don't have to hear from me anymore. One of the things that we want to make very clear, if the citizens do approve a new tax that includes funding for education and preservation, the work that the Conservancy currently does, any work that the city would award would be contingent on a request for proposal, a submittal, a competitive bid process, and a renewal. So each year when the City Council plans its budget, because they run on an annual budget, each year they would look at how much they would put into those programs. So it's one thing that we wanted to make clear to everyone, and through working with this, we were fully transparent with the city. We would love to be that partner, but we don't want anyone to think that there is any propriety towards us or anything. We want to do the hard work. We want to make sure that we submit that bid. We want to make sure that we are being the most competitive and providing the most value to the city. We are not afraid to be able to go up against anybody else who would like to do the work, and that's because of our amazing stewards. Because most other organizations would have substantial labor costs associated with fulfilling this work, the Conservancy is so blessed with our army of stewards that our costs to provide these services are substantially less than anyone else we believe would be interested in the business. So we'll work through that. Our current contract with the city is it's on a renewal. So one of the things, for those of you who remember, we went back to the city right after I started and renegotiated our contract because our original contract with the city was evergreen. It never expired. So we intentionally included a renewal in it, which is coming up here. And that's so that we can sit back down at the table and say, this is what the organization looked like when we first signed it. This is what it looks like now. A lot of people say, why was that so important? And when we entered into our original contract with the city that never expired, we had just over 100 stewards. There was just over 12,000 acres of preserve. There wasn't even 50 miles of trails. So as the organization grew by 700%, or by 7 times, excuse me, even in our volunteers, we didn't have the chance to go back to the city and say, hey, we know we agreed to this when we only had 100 people, but we can't now that we have 700. So that was the primary reason that we built in this renewal with the city, was so that we can come back to the table and say, here's what we're providing now, here's what you need. But also we know this is an evolving ecosystem. As our citizen scientists and stewards and everyone out there knows, the needs of the preserve change often. As we look at climate change, as we look at climate adaptation, as we look at urbanization, the services that we need to provide change. So we also need to be able to talk to the city about that. One of the things that we know, as I said, that could be a great benefit to the city if they move forward is, like I said, because of our stewards, we offer a very competitive advantage against some other folks that might want to come in and do this work. And as the Preserve Commission and the City Council work through this, we'd love to answer any questions. No, I'm happy to always talk about where we came from, also where we are, but also where we're going. So if there's ever any questions anyone has, if we don't get to it today, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, I'm going to kick it over to Jackie to talk about where we go from here.
Thank you. And I would just add one point based on what Justin said. It will be an annual budget process with the City of Scottsdale. The Preserve Commission will play a key role in that. So as we've been doing our work, we've been working with the Preserve Commission to get their input, make some changes, and ultimately they make the presentation to City Council. When we go through a budget process, assuming that we were to win business in the future, the Preserve Commission will play a role in that too. So I'm conscious that town halls were very much designed to be lots of time for questions. So I'm going to kind of try and do a bit of a whistle-stop tour and then open up to questions so that we can answer everything. But one thing I did want to touch on was Justin just mentioned it at the end. The reason we are able to look forwards and think about the future is because the work that's being done now and the work that's been done in the past. If I look back at the work that the staff, the stewards, our scientific partners and other partners have done, I always say, and some of my expressions don't translate, but we punch way above our weight. We accomplish much more than an organisation of this size normally would. So again, the work that's being done now and in the past gives us this platform so that we can move forwards. So over the last, Justin mentioned 2.5 years there, reminded me just now, it's actually the last 4 years that people have been looking at what we should be doing for the preserve in terms of long-term care. So there was a lot of research done at the beginning to look at different models. What do other organisations do to look after such an important piece of land? And there was one model which I think we can safely describe as the gold standard, it has a long name. So it's a National Park Service model, and it's called the Sonoran Desert Network Vital Signs Monitoring Plan, known as SODN for short, SODN. So this this is a model that was designed to create a robust ecological health monitoring system. It was designed by national park scientists, and it has been through multiple levels of stakeholder review and feedback. And therefore, that's why we felt this was a good, I guess, ultimate aim to work towards. As I said, it is gold standard. So we took the base Soden model. We looked at a couple of other similar ecological systems around here. We looked at Sora National Park and Tonto National Bridge. And that's really what gave us our list of what we felt the vital signs would be. So we have identified just under 40 vital signs for the preserve that we could monitor to help give us this really good overview of ultimately, is the preserve ecologically healthy? It doesn't translate to 38 scientific projects because there's a number of those a number of those vital signs that could be monitored under a single project. But this would really allow us to assess the ecological conditions of the preserve, evaluate, are things changing, help us try and identify what's caused those changes. Because the challenge any ecology has is there is no single factor that is making changes. So we have more urbanization, we have hotter, drier climate, we have non-native plants, we have a multiple things. So this monitoring, the aim is so that we can try and identify what driving factors are causing changes. And then the most important thing from there is what management actions are required to alleviate those changes. We then had our list of all the vital indicators we would like to look at. We bumped that up against our current list of projects, and the good news is a good number of those projects would need to continue or modify and would be part of that. We would also need to look at adding some. The piece that we can't forget as we go through this is outreach and education, and to me the two are kind of interchangeable. So it's great that we do this scientific work and we learn things about the impact that humans are having, but it's really important that we get this across to the general public as well, because each and every one of us can take actions to help alleviate those challenges. So for us, we embedded that in there. So we ended up with 5 key areas that we were looking at: outreach and education, invasives, habitat connectivity, long-term monitoring, and restoration. So right now, under the contract that Justin was just mentioning, the city reimburses us in the region of $100,000 per year for our scientific work. A full Soden model, so the full 38, 39 vital signs would cost in the region of $3 million. So you kind of have where we are right now and where we'd like to get to. We know it's going to be something in the middle. So based on the work we did with the Preserve Commission and the City Council, the work that we have under those 5 areas, we think would cost in the region of about $500,000 per year. And the yearly cost would vary because certainly when I'm looking at the scientific side, some of the projects need a long-term commitment. So there isn't much point doing some of the long-term monitoring for 2 or 3 years and then you lose funding. So as part of any budget process, we would want to make sure that the long-term projects truly have long-term funding and that we're not reviewing those projects every year. So to date, we have done an awful lot of research. We've looked at the different models. We've tried to cost out what this would cost in the $3 million that I just mentioned. The problem is for some of these vital signs, we don't actually know what projects are needed at this stage. An awful lot more work is needed before we can identify here's the project and therefore here's the costs. So at this point, they are costs rather than any kind of budget, and it's really just indicative numbers. So we have worked, Tiffany did a series of presentations to the Preserve Commission, I guess as a general education and awareness about what these topics mean and why they're so important. And then we've since then presented numbers to them so that they can get a sense of what's included. And this helped them factor on what they wanted to present to City Council. So in December, the Preserve Commission did present their plan to City Council. And if anyone's ever interested in listening to either the Commission meetings or the City Council meetings, they are all available to listen on the City of Scottsdale website. So Justin mentioned the City of Scottsdale, or the City Council's reaction was very much land acquisition is important. Let's make sure we have some funds in case there are key parcels of land that come across or that become available. But it may well not be that we ever get to that 34,000 acres. But in terms of the long-term care plan, the pieces that we heard the City Council were priorities was community engagement and education, invasives, protecting biodiversity, and restoration. So those are their kind of 4 key areas, which didn't really vary significantly from what we thought the key areas would be. So that's where we are right now. The City Council has given the Preserve Commission their initial reaction to the overall numbers, the $2 to $3 billion per year, and there was no sticker shock when that number went out there. And now the Preserve Commission will be fine-tuning their numbers and really trying to understand what is required for these different areas, and at a later date we'll go back to City Council. So that's kind of where we are right now. I mean, that was a whistle-stop tour. I mean, this has been a huge amount of work for staff, for stewards, for partners, for many, many others. And I think the fact that we are having this discussion around how do we take care of the city's largest asset? It's 20 times bigger than any other city asset. So trying to create a funding stream, which means that we're never having to think, do we have to pause projects? Do we have to stop projects? Time to create this so as the ecology keeps on evolving, we have a plan for how we can monitor it and ultimately make sure that this city asset and an asset for all of us remains healthy. Feels like a very positive conversation to be having. And I can say from my perspective, it is amazing to be at the table as we start having these discussions, because one of our challenges always is we help look after an asset we don't own. And that's always a kind of dance between us and the city, but it is great for us to be at the table helping drive this, which for me is probably the next most important thing for us. So I'm going to pause there. And do you have any questions?
Yes, yeah. So thank you both for sharing that. I think that was super helpful. I neglected to mention at the beginning that we were going to try to wrap up by 11:15, so that gives us about 45 minutes for questions, which is a decent amount. For those of you on Zoom, if you'd like to ask a question, please send it either directly to the moderator or to everyone so that we can get it involved. And I'd like to open it up to anybody in the room first, if there's a question to start us off with. I do have one on Zoom, if you'd rather wait. Mike was going to jump in there.
Yeah, I was just, when you look ahead at the priorities for the city versus what we're doing, what we plan to do going forward and what they plan to want us to do, what are the deltas? I mean, are there indications on things we would stop doing? And, you know, you did talk about the projects we have to focus on. Can you be a bit more specific on those two?
Oh my goodness, there's a long list of projects, and this is, so picking up a pure solar model and trying to apply it is way ambitious. So within that, there are either 38 or 39 vital indicators that we'll be looking at. We really need that fine-tuned down to the next level. And this is when the ERP comes into play. So as Justin mentioned, it was written as a kind of, here's a vision for what we want, but now we look back at it, it is not very specific, which means it's tough when we are now trying to look, okay, but what does that translate to in terms of project and in terms of priority areas? So for us, the fine-tuning and the revision to the ERP will give us those priority areas and projects that we need to work on. But in terms of broad things that continue, invasive non-natives absolutely stays as a priority, so does restoration. But what we are doing is looking at a slight change to the model, because up until now, I don't know whether the city would agree, but it's felt like we've identified the issue, we've mapped it, we're doing all the, I'm going to focus on invasives, we're doing all the removals, we're also doing the experiments, we're doing the monitoring. We're going to change that into a 3-step process. So the initial identification and mapping is phase 1, and that sits with the Conservancy. The large scale removal is phase 2, and that sits with the city. And then the ongoing monitoring, phase 3, sits with us. Because invasives are, we all see every time we're out there, they are going absolutely wild. With the most amazing stewards that we have, we are never going to get on top of it. It's time for the city to start bringing in professional removal crews to work alongside us and in partnership with us. And restoration is the same. We've been doing experiments on our restoration plots, and we've been doing some restoration. But if we really want to tackle some of these larger restoration areas, then it needs professionals coming in to do that. So again, we would map it, we would work with the city to help prioritize the areas. We would monitor to make sure that the remediation work is doing what we expect, but we aren't going to be doing kind of the hard labor piece of it. So those two absolutely continue. Much of our long-term monitoring projects continue, but we need to look at it project by project. So we do, I'm not going to get all of them. Doug's at the back, you might help me out. Bats, birds, butterflies, herbs, there's a lot that we monitor. Do each of these projects really tell us what management actions we need to take? I mean, it's great that we're identifying we have an issue from urbanization on species X, but if we can't do anything about that, how important that is that versus another project where we can monitor something and there are management actions that we can actually take. So that's some of the assessment that Melanie is doing right now.
And I can say Jackie hit the nail on the head, and why we were so supportive about the city going back and revisiting the ecological resource plan before going to the voters is because we've seen it over the past few years. The most recent being the bonds that passed, but there were many info sessions where the city was asked, okay, what specifically are you going to do? And because of the way municipal government works, they don't invest past a certain dollar to plan out a program unless they know the funding's coming. So they would say, here's a really good idea of what we're going to do, but we can't tell you specifically what we're going to do until we know we're going to get the money, because we can't invest any more staff salaries into building it out if we don't know if we can do it. So when the concept came up at the Preserve Commission to refine the ecological resource plan before going to the voters, we were so excited to champion that, because then when they go to the voters, the city can say, this is exactly what we're going to do. It's not just here's what we'd like to figure out what to do. They're gonna say, no, these are the management actions we're gonna do to make sure we do this. So that's why we're really excited to support the refinement of the ecological resource plan, because then that will go through its approval processes to say, no, this is the doctrine to be what we can do.
And we specifically won't lead or be the consultant to update the ERP, because we feel that will be a conflict of interest for us to drive the update of the document and then bid on the work that the document says. So we will be sat at the table for that discussion, but we won't lead that.
So along with this topic, we have a question on Zoom from Fred Mermelstein about the 4 or 5, if you could repeat the 4 or 5 main areas of focus for this plan. He remembers restoration, community engagement, over some of the others.
So outreach and education, invasives, habitat connectivity, long-term monitoring and restoration.
There's also another question from Art Rands. I think this one's going to be for Justin. Going back to the potential tax measures, what is an appropriate thing for stewards today to be talking about related to that issue? Is there something that stewards should be sharing about that?
Well, it's still TBD, but absolutely, if people ask about it, stewards can share that the City Council and the Preserve Commission, in combination with the Conservancy, is looking at what is long-term care and maintenance of the Scottsdale McDowell Sonoran Preserve. It's one of the things that we know that the City Council has stated an intent to go back to the voters for a preserve tax renewal that would partially support ongoing maintenance, and that we're very supportive of that. But it will be over the next year to year and a half that we can refine the talking points. But rest assured, for anyone who's a steward or even on the staff, that once we get that refinement, the Conservancy will be sending out advocacy points, because as a nonprofit organization that was founded on the principles of being the advocates for the McDowell Mountains, we 100% will put our advocacy hat back on and become the advocates for this long-term care. So once we have refined it, we'll definitely send it far and wide of what we want to educate people on. Because we know, and I would be remiss if I didn't say, it was the amazing people that came along before us that made this possible. All of the advocates for this originally, all of the people who historically helped build the Conservancy and build out the preserve, we wouldn't be here today. And I remember seeing the pictures of them with the picket signs on the side of Scottsdale Road, because that was how you got things passed. I remember Carla sharing how they do the hikes and the preserve with the elementary school kids when it was pre-preserve and all of these amazing things that they did to do that. But in today's social media era, in a headline world where if you talk to someone for more than 15 seconds, they're generally gone. It's going to take a lot of voices doing a lot of talking and doing a lot of advocating to get that out. Like what used to be a lot easier, and that's why I love the field trip stories that Carla and Jane and all of them talked about, was because you ever want to get parents to be supportive of something, make sure their kids come home and talk about it nonstop. Then they can't say I didn't know about it. But in today's environment, we know it's going to be harder to get that reach. So Art will definitely, as we get more talking points, refine them. But at this point in time, if we just want to continue on the course that we're supportive of the council and the commission and the city, seriously evaluating and taking action on long-term maintenance costs, because it's one of the things that Jackie hit on sort of a little bit with education outreach. One of the reasons we're using that as one of our largest platforms is because we talk about it in development, we talk about it in anything you're passionate about, whether it's hobbies, is it's you support what you love and you love what you know. If you don't know about something, you can't fall in love with it. And if you don't fall in love with it, you're probably not going to support it. And all of us aren't going to be here 50, 60, 100 years from now. We need that next generation of folks to love this place just as much as we do. So our education outreach program obviously wants to make sure that we impact the users to have the least impact on the system here, but also how do we get the next generations of conservationists and stewards to love this place, to carry our torch long past from here.
Awesome, thank you. Do we have any other questions in the room here? Please think if you have questions.
Oh.
So while Brian looks for that, I'll share last night I was at the city of Scottsdale. I've run a couple of sustainability forums and Brian popped it in last week's Thursday email, and it was one in North Scottsdale, one in South Scottsdale. It was just gathering, there were probably about 50 people, just residents from all different walks of life. And it was really a brainstorming session to what would the residents like to see happen for Scottsdale sustainability. So what does sustainability mean to you in various different areas? And I will share the range of different ideas that came from people were amazing, but two big items. So we did a brainstorming, threw ideas out, we then wrote them on stickies and put them across different areas and then voted on it. And two of the key areas that came out of there was one, ecological education, especially focused on K through 12. And a funding stream for the preserve. So that was, again, I obviously was saying what I thought, but there were 49 other people in the room, and it made me happy to see that so many other people out there felt that those are really key areas that Scottsdale needs to focus on to ensure it remains sustainable in the future. So I think they will be holding some more of those forums. So, and I know they will be sending a survey out as well. So others are interested, we'll keep including it in Thursday emails as we hear about things.
All right, so there's also a question from Tom and Karen. This is for Justin. Could you provide some examples of the type of contracts that the Conservancy might bid on for the city of Scottsdale?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. So basically I've spoke with the Preserve Commission and the City Council because we want this to be as transparent as possible. We know that sometimes in city relationships, people say, oh, okay, how did they get around to providing that service for a city? Wait a second, how do they do that for 15 years without having to rebid? So when we approached this, we said all of those areas that Jackie identified. So those 5 areas, and then if they have sub areas, breaking those out into scopes of work. So if they had an education outreach component, they wanted to do with the preserve. I'll give you an example of something we've been toying with the school district on. Okay, we're going to provide every grade, or one grade, excuse me, that every single student goes through the preserve in that grade. I'll use the 3rd grade as the example, because that's what our expedition days currently aligns with because of the curriculum standards. Let's say that we and the school district agree, moving forward, we want every 3rd grader in 2022 to come through the preserve. And every year we want every third grade, or the next year we want every third grader in 2023 to come through the preserve. And the next year we want every third grader with the concept of every student comes through the preserve. There's costs associated with that, whether it be school buses, if there's substitute teachers, if there's chaperones, if there's lunches, if there's any of those, that we believe that the citizens, the Conservancy, and the school district would say, yes, it is important that every single one of our students gets through the preserve. So that would be that's a concept, nothing for sure. But if that was included in the education portion of what the city wanted to provide, that contract would be what we would bid on. So that's really what we're looking at in these contracts and scopes of work more appropriately. Here's the level of services that we want the Conservancy or whomever to provide, bid on it, and tell us you can do it. So right now, we know we've got a great program where if a certain school or school district, because we even see it in Scottsdale, that a lot of our schools in North Scottsdale, their PTAs are able to donate a lot more to pay for costs of buses and things like that, versus the South Scottsdale schools that don't have the economic ability for families to donate to the school's field trips. So they might not have access. So this was what we were talking about in an economic downturn or a time of uncertainty, that we would still be able to provide those services to, in this example, education. Jackie's other example was perfect. If the city built out a scope of work that said, okay, for invasive non-native plant species, we want 2 contractors to work on this scope of work, 1 to do the identification and 1 to do removals and then 1 to do, and then as Jackie pointed out, step 1 and 3 together, the city could break that out into 2 different contracts, 1 for step 1 and 3 and 1 for step 2. And then again, it would ensure that we're contractually obligated to provide it. The city's contractually obligated to help cover the cost of it, and that it would get done. So I'm happy to dive deeper into that, but hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks for also sharing what some of the dollars would go to, since most of the work would be done by volunteers. That was also part of the question. So thank you.
Yeah, so the great example, when Jackie and I were working through it, as she perfectly articulated, if we were to adopt full SODM, which we can't do because it'd be crazy, that in itself was almost a $4 million price tag to adopt SODM if we were a contractor that didn't have any volunteers, that did all of that. And that's where Jackie said the city council didn't have the sticker shock at the 500,000, because that seems like a moderate thing. Because of all of our volunteers, we're able to substantially reduce our costs. The example I use is all of the volunteer hours that we work with the city on. We work with the city auditor's office to monetize that. And it's just about $1.8 million a year on a full non-COVID year. So with that, we're providing the city with $1.8 million in labor they'd otherwise have to pay for to do this work. That's why our stewards are the most amazing asset, not only for us, but the city. And that's why we could be able to do a large scale program for only a couple $100,000, because the costs that we're having to cover are ancillary service costs because of our stewards. But if another provider would come and bid on it, it would be substantially more because they don't have those resources. The example that I can most frequently use is the Grand Canyon Conservancy. When I met with them, this was pre-COVID, so they've had some reorgs since then. But because of the cost of living in Grand Canyon Village, they have very few volunteers. So they count on tourists coming out and doing the programs and paid staff. But we don't have that unique problem as difficultly as if you don't even look at Grand Canyon and most of the preserves that are in rural areas. They just don't have the access to the people. So it's the Conservancy stewards that are able to provide this amazing savings for the city to take care of the most amazing treasure that we have.
And if I look at the SODM model, the costing that we've done, and again, I'm really stretching my memory here, but Justin said it was almost 4 million for the full. It was almost half of that for the Conservancy to do it. And that was very much a reflection of the fact that we can use so many of our stewards to help with that. So as we presented these numbers to Preserve Commission and the city, we did present both numbers because we're never presuming that we will win the work. We believe we have a huge competitive advantage, but we also think it's important that the Commission and City Council understand how much it would cost if they got somebody off the street to do it. And then the second piece I'd add is our SOWs that we're under right now for our invasives restoration and some of our other science work actually runs out at the end of September this year. So over the summer, there will be a rebidding process. And one of the good things, one, it's painful to see out of work, but one of the good things about it is it gives everybody a chance to sit and think, okay, we're now 3 years down the line from when we wrote this, things have moved on. So it just means we can make sure that the required SOWs now reflect the work that's needed for the next 3 years rather than what we've done.
Can you just remind everybody what an SOW is?
Well, for a Brit, it's different. So
And the city refers to it as a scope of work.
it's a statement of work for a Brit. So
Excellent. Any questions? If anyone on Zoom would like to unmute to ask a question, that is perfectly acceptable at this time as well. But feel free to share in the chat with the moderator or with everyone your questions. We'll give it a minute here to see if anybody can think of something.
Just listening to what was said, as you say, I'm not sure everyone when they hear, oh, it's a rebidding process, sees that as a good thing. So I'm glad that we've covered that. And secondly, that the going back to the city and the Preserve Commission and so on, and the mechanics of all of this does give people the opportunity to revisit what's happening in 2022 and beyond, rather than just what happened years ago when this was. So I think those points are really important, and I'm glad you brought them out. So frankly, that's more feedback, because I think some people who hear this feel a little bit, there may be a threat, it may be uncertain, our future might be in doubt, and particularly when you reconcile it with talking about the Conservancy changing too. So I don't know if you want to sort of comment a little bit on that, but those messages together can make people feel a little uneasy.
And I know from our perspective, at least how I look at it and like to think that most folks do, is we aren't afraid of that rebidding process, because our organization operates 100% transparently in what we do. As Jackie said, the Preserve Commission, when I went in and gave them the cost for an outside contractor to provide the services to meet this model, and the substantial cost increase is what is unique to us. That's why we want to go forward, because we know there are a lot of things. The city has a little bit of baggage from things done in years past with other organizations that weren't so transparent. So because we know that the city values us as an asset, and not only the Preserve, but the Conservancy as an asset, we are happy to go look forward to those, because also we are looking at them through the different lens. So you talk about how we've evolved. One of the things that our board transitioned, when it transitioned to its governance model as well, a lot when I came on almost 5 years ago, was that we said we will make no decisions as a business without looking at them through two separate lenses. And it's what I often tell the board. I said that the thing I think about at the end of every single day is that we're a business and a nonprofit. And we can be a business without being a nonprofit, but we can't be a nonprofit without being a business. In our past, we've made a lot of decisions that were based on the passion of the nonprofit work. And that's how we ended up in such financial straits 6 and 7 years ago. I mean, we were in a very unfortunate financial spot. So now we have evolved our relationship with the city to really talk about, we're a service provider that is doing a service for you. This is how you can make sure that we're a viable, sustainable business, but also take advantage of the great opportunity we have of having this army of people that are passionate about the work you do. And that's changed our relationship with the city a lot. Our relationship with the city 5 years ago was a little bit confrontational. And one of the things that we've done a great job in our stewards and my amazing staff in the board's work is demonstrating to the city what a great asset we are, and also demonstrating to the city what a great asset they are. It was one of those where it was a push and pull before, where we have this amazing relationship we've built up with the city that they recognized they couldn't do what they do without us. But also because of their amazing asset, we couldn't do what we do without them. So it's no longer, oh, we're just a contractor of yours, or we're just the volunteers that do it. The city and the Conservancy recognize that we are strategic partners in making this happen. They couldn't do it without us, and we couldn't do it without them. So because of that, we're going into everything together. The other thing is you talk about the growth, because I'm involved in a lot of the politics that maybe some of my folks don't have to get involved in. Of 5 years ago, when we were originally going to the city saying, we need you to help fund some of our services to take care of the preserve, because we've grown from 100 volunteers to 700. You've grown the preserve from 12,000 to 30,000 acres. You've gone from 25 miles of trails to 230. At the time, our organization, and again, it predates me, but I have the historical context from when I came on, was asking the city to cover about 40 to 45% of our budget. That is a substantial ask. I can definitely understand from a political lens how that might look a little fishy. As we sit today at the couple 100,000 up to 500,000 we're talking about, that is such a much smaller portion of our budget that it is essentially a contract. When we look at our overall budget to it, the organization has excelled in having great strategic and exceptional growth. But that's because we're working as a business and working as a mission-driven organization. We talked about it in the last town hall, but people are viewing us as a great organization that they want to invest in and get involved in financially, in addition to the work that our amazing volunteers do in person, but also financially, that we've been fortunate. People see us operating as this successful nonprofit and business, so our financial support has grown. So I can understand through the lens when it was over 40% of our budget, and now as we're looking at the range that the city's talking about, it's anywhere between really 8% and up to probably about 18% of our budget. That's not as hard of a pill to swallow. And we were talking about it with the preserve commissioners, as they said, well, how come the city can work on this project? Can't you go fundraise for that? And we said, we can, but if we purely fundraise, then a downturn comes, fundraising drops, our services drop. So what we're looking forward to is if we're able to move forward with the city on this project, doesn't mean we're going to stop fundraising. Doesn't mean that the folks on my team and myself aren't going to go out and try and expand on the projects. But we've talked with the city, if they can help us cover our baseline costs, we'll put all of our time, effort, and energy going out trying to do 300% of the work if we can garner outside support. But I can't enter into a contract with the city that says we're going to provide this baseline level of service unless I know we can afford to keep it through any downturn. So the organization has shifted a lot in the last 5 years. We've grown substantially. You've seen it in the team. You've seen it. I've even seen it in our stewards. I remember when I started, we had 600. Now we have 700. That's even exponential growth coming through a pandemic. But because we've diversified and operated as a successful business that serves the mission of science education and stewardship and is the amazing champions of the Mcdowell Sonoran Preserve, a lot more people have come to the table to say, we want to help you do the work. Does that help?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Justin. You've talked long enough to give us a couple more questions here. So.
Why do I get more questions? No, I love it. I love it.
It should be a short one for you, Justin, from Barbara Lombardo. She's interested to know what are some examples of organizations that might be competing for those contracts with the Conservancy.
That is a great question. I'll use an example of what Jackie referred to when we used to do our invasive removals. So if the city were to put a contract out and say, okay, we need to remove 50 acres of buffalo grass, the Conservancy could put in a bid to do it, and the stewards would kill us, I'm sure, because that is a lot of hard labor, or a contractor could do it. So the example of someone who might want to compete against us is another conservation organization. Or, as we've seen throughout the country, not just here, sometimes academic institutions want to come in and do the work, but their costs are so much higher. So whether it be a university, another competing nonprofit, or believe it or not, nonprofit or for-profit entities do come in and try and compete with the nonprofit world. those people would like a piece of the business because they know if we don't get it, I'll just use an example. Let's say it was $100,000 for a for-profit entity and maybe $50,000 for a nonprofit entity to do it. That $100,000 for-profit will still bid on it just in case the nonprofit doesn't succeed in getting it. So even though we've seen it with some of the other capital projects in town, that they're like, oh yeah, the city's put out an RFP saying we're going to spend $3 million on it, and it ends at $6 million. And it's because those people came to the table. They still will, which is why we have to be on our game.
Great, thank you. All right, so I've got a question for Jackie. This comes from Art, and he is curious, like in light of the discussion this morning, can you touch on how the new community engagement program is going to be playing a role in this future?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So for those that read the Thursday email, will see that we created a new program, and Art and I have been talking about this for the last couple of months. And pre-COVID, we'd started building out our community outreach. We really started figuring out where should we go. Some of our strategic plan objectives are about engaging different communities. So we know the users of the preserve know certainly who the preserve is and hopefully who we are. But how do we start to get into other communities so that they understand that the preserve is there and also what we do? So we started to figure out what festivals should we go to, what outreach events should we be at, and then COVID put it all to a crushing halt just when we were starting to get a bit of a roll on. So this program is going to look at multiple pieces of it. One, where should we be from an outreach perspective? What events are there in different communities that we can go to so that we can raise awareness for us, for the preserve, for the importance of natural open spaces, and to help people realize that we all have a role to play in this. We also, when we talk about that, we talk about the Speakers Bureau. We have amazing speakers. And yeah, I think if you go down far enough on our website, you manage to find it, but we could do a lot more in terms of getting our speakers out to these people. So Max has done a wonderful job of running the program, but it's very much been in reaction to people sending requests to us. How can we make that more proactive? So the whole, as we talk through even invasives restoration, all of these areas, people need to understand more about this, to understand they have a role to play. And even if they don't feel they have a role to play, that they understand why it's important. And that's the whole thrust of the community engagement program. It's really to figure out how do we translate the scientific work we're doing, the educational work we're doing, and everything through communities throughout the valley.
And I'll give you the perfect example, not just something that impacted us, but impacted a peer organization, and it's going to be a great case study. I did an interview on Earth Day on our poop flagging campaign. I know the most glorious program we do, but I did an interview on our poop flagging campaign. And then the next week I got a call from the CEO of the Sedona Chamber of Commerce. And they said, we love that idea. We have a huge trash problem in Sedona. We'd never even thought of going out and getting irrigation flags and having people mark all the trash. You know, how have you guys been so successful? And in the interview, I talked about the visualization. You know, people let their dog poop and they go, it's just one little dog poop. It's not a big thing. But when they see the impact of everyone who had one, it helps educate them on what they can do differently. Our community engagement program is going to go out into the community to engage them and talk about these ideas. Because right now, or not right now, but previous to COVID, it was dependent on people coming to the preserve to learn from us. We're looking at how can we go to the people to teach them about this place and what they can do. But hopefully Sedona City Council is going to vote yes on it, and they're going to go out with irrigation flags and mark all the trash at all the trailheads in Sedona so that the visitors can visually see the impact that leaving their trash makes.
I have one more question from Zoom. Is there any other questions in the room that I'm going to jump in first? So Carrie Olson asked, this is for Justin, I believe, can you speak to the police department's announcement at a recent commission meeting about support for the preserve?
I'll take that.
Sorry.
Well, I was like, I can talk about how it started.
Yeah, so at a recent, the last preserve commission meeting, the city has heard loud and clear from the stewards that we always say our roles are educators, not enforcers. But we are sometimes put in a position where we feel that we are required to do enforcement activities. So the city has heard this loud and clear over many years, and they have now, again, this is subject to City Council approving the budget. Within the budget for fiscal 23, we'll create 3 to 4 law enforcement officer roles that will be dedicated to Scottsdale's natural open area spaces. So it does cover the parks in Scottsdale as well, but this will be a dedicated police force to manage the enforcement pieces of that. So we have been asked, one word of caution, these people are going to need considerable training. So even if they are appointed on the 1st of July, they are going to need quite a lot of training before they can really be out there. So please don't expect to see them out there on July 2nd. But this was very much the city hearing and fully understanding that there is a need for enforcement services out there. The beauty of having a dedicated force for this is, in the past, every time the city have tried to allocate some of their enforcement resources to preserve areas, if there is a significant accident or a significant event, those people get pulled. The beauty of this force is that they are dedicated to Scottsdale's natural open spaces. In the event of a massive citywide emergency, they would be pulled, but they won't be pulled for events, accidents, all of those kind of things. And so we will be able to partner with the city of Scottsdale preserve staff to figure out where are the greatest needs. So when we do poop, as we're talking poop, well, when we're doing the poop flag, it is at a useful time. Every now and again, they got the animal people out during that. But as we do share the trails day, we know we have some nighttime use in the preserve. We can actually start looking at these issues and figuring out what are the most important ones and where can the police really help, in addition to just being generally available. Because I know when I'm out there with my blue shirt on and I'm having to ask someone to obey the rules, I'm not likely to need to ask if there's a police officer in the vicinity. So I think this gives us something that we have been asking for some time. We need to know, it's very exciting that it's coming, we just need to make sure we accept that there is a training period, as well as we are going to need to work with the city to figure out where are the areas of greatest need. So 3 to 4 officers obviously can't cover the entire preserve at all time, but this is a huge win for us.
And I would like to add, just so everyone watching and here knows, this is directly because of the new police chief. So I know the stewards have been talking to city staff for years about the enforcement problem. And when the city manager appointed Chief Walther, I was one of the first people on his calendar advocating for what the stewards have been saying forever. And Chief Walther and I had a one-on-one, and I said, this is a major problem. The previous administration, every time the city had allocated funds for open spaces, the police department administration reallocated them to the entertainment district. You all know it's Old Town because they never have enough enforcement down there. So Chief Walther and I brainstormed on, instead of getting money specifically just to add officers, getting officers that were park rangers, law enforcement park rangers. And the chief loved it because when they put out the employment posting, when they put out the job posting, it's specifically that you are to work in the parks and preserves. So unlike, not saying all of our patrol officers in the city don't love hiking in their polyester uniforms out in the preserve, but we've seen they get about 100 feet from the parking lot and they're good. They want to go back to their car. These officers will be hired specifically with the direct knowledge that their job is to be out there. And what that offers the city for enforcement, instead of trying to get someone who wants to be in an air conditioned car out, it's people who want to be out when they apply for the job. So it's a really exciting opportunity for us. And if any of you see Chief Walther, thank him directly, because it is because of him that this happened.
Well, thank you both for sharing that exciting news and for setting our expectations about it as well. Mike, did you have anything else?
Oh, no.
Okay, sorry. Were there any other questions in the room? I think we have time for one more. We're on Zoom, your last chance here. Because if not, I think that's been a wonderful, productive morning, and I want to thank you both for presenting. Just a quick reminder that we are planning a third town hall in June, and there should be more information shared about that in the coming weeks.
So thank you all for watching, attending. Thank you, Brian, for being our expert moderator. And hope everyone has a great and amazing day.
Thank you.
Thanks.